So you may have noticed recently that GPU prices are starting to fall, at least in the UK and the US, and we have a whole video going through that on the channel, so definitely check that out. But what that now allows me to do is to look at cards from both AMD and Nvidia now that pricing has leveled out a little bit, and do a direct comparison. Latest drivers, latest games, head-to-head type stuff, and see who comes out on top. Now, looking at the cards we have here today, I had to do some scouting around to see who had what and what prices they were coming in at. And that left me with some questions before I'd even started. But before we jump into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. I wish these files would transfer faster. Come on! Whoa, is that the FireStrike 510 NVMe drive with its blistering fast speeds of 3450 megabytes a second read, 3200 megabytes a second write, and capacities of up to 2 terabyte? I can have these files transferred in no time. And if I'm looking for the ultimate performance, I could even get the 4th generation FireStrike 520. I better check the link in the description to find out more details. So 3 cards, 3 similar price points. Who's the victor? Well, to start with, the MSI 3080 Supreme X. While it looks like I have 2 here, they are ever so slightly different in that one is a 10GB model and one is a 12GB model, which I think is safe to say my thoughts on it were made pretty clear when it launched, but you know, we're past that now. Instead, the big question that's been raised is that right now I can buy a 10GB 3080 for £799 or $850, or for £980 or $990, I can get a 3080 12GB. So which one do I go for? That's what we're going to find out. But then, to throw something else into the mix, the 6900 XT from AMD is available right now for £1,000 or $999. So basically the same price as the 3080 12GB. This is what begs the question, and something that anyone with around £1,000 or around $1,000 would be asking right now. Which one do you go for? We all know that Nvidia has the upper hand when it comes to ray tracing, but you may remember from our launch day coverage of the 6900 XT, AMD gave a bit of a bitch slap to Nvidia when it came to pure rasterization performance in the latest titles. So some of this could really come down to being title specific and, of course, if ray tracing really matters to you. Now, eagle-eyed viewers will see that both the Nvidia cards we have here are the Supreme X models from MSI. So in a kind of comparison to a reference 6900 XT, I get it. They do have a slight upper hand, but knowing that models like these typically come in a bit more expensive, around £150 or $150 more, once you see the benchmarks, you can do your own workings out to see if you think spending even more money is worth it for the gains that you actually get. As always, we chuck these cards onto our GPU test system, consisting of an Asus Crosshair 8 Dark Hero X570 motherboard, Ryzen 9 5900X, Noctua D15S cooler, and 32GB of Corsair Dominator Platinum 3600MHz DDR4 memory. We kept resizable bar and smart access memory disabled so that those of you with older generation cards can make a direct comparison. It's also worth noting that all cards were tested on their latest drivers at the time of filming, and all cards were tested at 1080p, 1440p and 4K. One more thing is that if you want to see all the charts in full, we'll be uploading them to Patreon for everyone to check out there. So jumping straight into 3D Mark FireStrike, and we see the 6900 XT storming ahead of both the RTX 3080s, while also showing us that the extra 2GB of VRAM on the 3080 does make a solid difference with a nice little boost in performance. In FireStrike Ultra, it's the same story again, with AMD storming ahead of the competition, and again showing the 12GB is the superior card over the 10GB, though that's expected for its higher price point. In TimeSpy, the results between the 3080 12GB and 6900 XT drew ever closer to each other, with the 6900 XT sitting just ahead. The extra VRAM on both these cards clearly made a difference in this test, with the 10GB 3080 falling behind. In TimeSpy Extreme, we saw the 3080 12GB surpass AMD by just under 150 points. Maybe Nvidia will fare better in our newer titles based on this one test. The 6900 XT still ended up beating out the 3080 10GB, which comes in at the same price. When it comes to synthetic ray tracing tests, the Nvidia cards obviously came out on top by quite some margin. We all know that Nvidia has the upper hand when it comes to ray tracing, and that was clearly shown today. The 12GB also pushes ahead by some margin when compared to the 10GB model as well. In our last synthetic benchmark, the 6900 XT takes the top spot again, though only by a small margin, while the 10GB car falls last. Based on this result, the 6900 XT is looking to be the better buy right now. So moving on to some game performance, and starting with Assassin's Creed Valhalla. We see the 6900 XT leaving both Nvidia cards in its dust, with a clear 30 frames per second lead. The extra 2GB of VRAM over the 10GB did show a difference, but sadly only of 1.7%. It was very much the same story at 1440p, with the 6900 XT sticking it to Team Green. The 10GB versus the 12GB showed no real difference at all, and at this point, while synthetic showed larger margins, the price difference doesn't really warrant the extra 2GB. At 4K, while the gap does look a little bit narrower, the 6900 XT still came out on top by around 7%. Again, the extra VRAM, which you'd think would make a big difference at 4K, didn't really show too much of a difference between the two Nvidia cards. Moving over to Borderlands 3 at 1080p, and the performance on all three cards were actually very similar, though AMD still managed to edge ahead. Admittedly, if you are playing this at 1080p on high, I'd wonder why you'd have bought any of these cards, as any difference at 180 FPS in this game wouldn't actually be noticeable. At 1440p, the gap was still prevalent between all three cards, with AMD again leading the way, though only by 3%. The extra VRAM again makes a small difference, though not worth the extra cost in my opinion. At 4K, the 3080 12GB managed to squeeze just past the 6900 XT, albeit by less than 1 frame per second, while the 10GB sat just behind by a couple of frames. From a cost to value perspective, the 6900 XT still shows to offer the better value of the three cards. In Dirt 5, a game that is typically found to favour AMD, we actually see the opposite, with both Nvidia cards ahead by some margin. We also saw our first real glimpse as to how the extra VRAM on the 12GB model does actually make a difference compared to the 10GB, though at these high frame rates, it's nothing the average gamer would notice in this title. At 1440p, it was very much the same story, with the 3080 12GB leading the way and the other two cards falling behind, though both with very similar results around 160 frames per second. At 4K, the 6900 XT came in last, though only by 2 frames per second, and the 3080 12GB still held the crown, albeit by around 7 FPS. Whether that extra 7 FPS is worth the extra cash is, of course, entirely up to you. Moving over to Godfall, and we see all three cards performing essentially the same. There is a slight variance that puts AMD ahead by a few FPS, but nothing that really makes them a clear winner. At 1440p, that gap shifts ever so slightly, putting the 6900 XT ahead of both Nvidia cards, and the lower memory 3080 falling behind by some margin when comparing to the 12GB model, which, as we know, is the more expensive card out of the two Nvidia cards we're testing today. At 4K, the gap between the cards grew closer again, with the 6900 XT still ahead by 1 whole frame, while the 10GB 3080 fell behind again by slightly more. Again, looking at pricing of the cards, the 6900 XT is looking to be the favourite so far. In Horizon Zero Dawn at 1080p, we again see the order of the cards the same way we've seen through most of our testing. The 6900 XT is ahead by around 3.5%, while the 10GB falls behind by 8 frames per second. At 1440p, the order changes ever so slightly, with the 12GB 3080 sitting at the top of our charts, though only by 2 frames per second, while the 10GB sits behind the 6900 XT by 7 FPS. And remember, both of these cards are priced the same. At 4K, the difference grew slightly between all three cards, but I'll leave it up to you to decide if the 5 frames per second when at over 80 FPS is worth the extra cost of a 3080 12GB Supreme X over a reference 6900 XT. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is typically again favoured by AMD hardware, and that shows at 1080p with a 6% lead over the competition. Both Nvidia cards performed fairly equally, showing that the extra VRAM really didn't make any big difference. At 1440p, the gap stayed at around 6% between the 3080 12GB and the RX 6900 XT, while the 10GB model sat a few FPS lower, yet still remaining competitive. At 4K, all three of the cards all perform the same or within 1% of each other. Based on these results, I'd say you'd have to consider the price of all cards and make your decision based on the performance versus the cost. Moving over to Watch Dogs Legion, at 1080p again we see the 6900 XT ahead by a modest 4%. It's not a huge amount, but it is the cheaper card compared to the 12GB 3080 Supreme X. Looking at both the Nvidia cards with 2 FPS between them really begs the question as to why you'd pay more for the 12GB model. At 1440, the gap grows ever so slightly, still in favour of the 6900 XT, and again sees both Nvidia cards performing basically the same at this resolution. At 4K, things move around slightly, with the 3080 12GB moving to the top of the stack and the 10GB sitting just below by 3 frames per second. In a turn of events, the 6900 XT now just sits below at 82 FPS. So while it's safe to say the 6900 XT is looking like it's on top, we have to move on to ray tracing performance with Dirt 5. And as expected, this is where Nvidia take the crown by quite some margin, with an 18% lead over the 6900 XT. The 12GB also sits around 8% ahead of the lower VRAM 3080 as well, so I guess with that, maybe it is worth the extra cash. At 1440p, the lead drops slightly, with the 12GB 8% ahead of the 6900 XT and the 10GB model sitting comfortably between the two. I'm actually quite surprised by how well the 6900 XT holds up, but it is only RT shadows and not full-blown ray tracing. At 4K, the cards all perform within about 5% of each other, and while the 3080 12GB does sit ahead, it's only by 3 frames per second when comparing against the other RTX 3080. Booting Godfall back up and looking at ray tracing performance, the more expensive two cards perform better than the 10GB, with the 3080 12GB sitting slightly ahead as expected. None of these performance results are anything to grumble at, though I doubt you'd be spending £1,000 in gaming at 1080p. At 1440p, the results spread out a little bit more, with the RTX 3080 12GB pushing ahead by a whopping 30 frames per second when comparing to the Radeon GPU. Comparing the 3080 10GB and 6900 XT, we see similar results, though the 6900 XT does just claw ahead by 6 frames per second. Though remember, this is slightly more expensive, being a SupremeX model. At 4K, it's very much the same, with the 3080 12GB ahead by around 20% to the 10GB and 24% to the 6900 XT. I've got to ask, is the ray tracing performance enough to make you forget how the 6900 XT performed better in pure rasterization? Moving on to Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition, and again we see Nvidia coming out on top with both their 10GB and 12GB cards, while the 6900 XT sits just behind. At 1440p, it's the same, with the 12GB ahead of the 10GB by 6 frames per second and another 9 frames per second between the 10GB and 6900 XT at 96.68 FPS. At 4K, we see the same order yet again, with the 12GB ahead by a hefty 18% and the 6900 XT trailing just behind the 10GB version. It's also worth noting that the 12GB was the only card that managed to peak above 60 FPS. In our last ray tracing test, Watchdog Legions at 1080p, we actually saw the 10GB 3080 push forward ahead of the 12GB. Though with it only being a 1 FPS difference, I think we can safely say that margin of error could have something to say about this. Nvidia also show on both cards that they have superior performance when it comes to ray tracing when compared to AMD. At 1440p, the 12GB managed to come back out on top by 3 frames per second when compared to the 10GB, which was then around 19 frames per second ahead of the 6900 XT. Lastly, at 4K, it was the same thing all over again, with the 12GB slightly ahead, albeit by 1 FPS to the 10GB, of which both cards sat comfortably ahead of the 6900 XT from AMD. So a bit of a mixed bag of results, but I think it's safe to say that there are arguments for both AMD and Nvidia. If looking at pure rasterization, it's easy to see that AMD are the clear winner in pretty much every test and at every resolution. At the higher resolutions, Nvidia was still competitive, but maybe that extra VRAM from the 6900 XT makes all the difference. Now, one area where Nvidia did have the upper hand, though, is still ray tracing. It's clear to see that those dedicated RT cores still give the extra performance Nvidia need when compared to AMD's ray accelerators. Either way, it's going to be interesting to see what the next generation of cards come along with from both AMD and Nvidia, especially when it comes to things like ray tracing performance. You know, according to Nvidia, they are all in when it comes to ray tracing. So what is the next generation actually going to give us? Hopefully so much more. The truth of it is that Nvidia have kind of been utilizing ray tracing technology for a little bit longer. So I guess they simply have more experience with it. And AMD should catch up at some point soon. It's just going to take a little bit more time. Now, performance is one thing, but there's other parts of GPUs that fall under the performance realm, while not talking about gameplay, but acoustics, that's one of them. Funnily enough, the 6900 XT in its reference form was actually a fair bit quieter than both the Nvidia RTX cards, which is actually surprising, as you'd expect a reference card to generally be louder. Though I think we're all aware that reference cards have come a long way, both in terms of design and performance, just over the last couple of years. I mean, this is a properly good looking card. Now, generally, acoustics and temperatures kind of go hand in hand, and that's quite clear to see, as the 6900 XT came in the hottest at 89 degrees. So while it was the quietest, I do think the fan curve could maybe do with some work to bring the temperatures a bit more into alignment, especially when compared to the competition. It's also worth noting that the extra 2GB of VRAM really makes a difference when it comes to temperatures, which is quite surprising. I didn't expect the difference to be quite as large. The other area that we need to look at comes down to total system power, where we see the AMD reference card come in the lowest at 425.3 watts, and both NVIDIA cards with their fancier cooler, more prolific RGB and all around beefier design coming in slightly more. Again, for the only real difference being the size or capacity of the memory, I wasn't actually expecting such a difference between the two 3080 models. So there we have it. I mean, what card would you buy if you were in the market right now and had £1,000 or $1,000 to spend? I mean, which one do you go for? Well, if you don't care about ray tracing, the obvious answer is the 6900 XT. It just makes the most sense when it comes to pure rasterization. Though be prepared for it to run slightly hotter. Though I guess the way around that is to buy an aftermarket card, which will then have a beefier cooler. Though then you'll be, expected to pay a little bit more money over the kind of reference spec. So swings and roundabouts. You gotta love how things work, right? Now, if it was me and I didn't care about ray tracing, then the 6900 XT is the one I'd go for. It's a bit of a no-brainer. Though if ray tracing was something I wanted to utilize and enjoy, and that was out of the question, which 3080 do I go for? Well, I think that's a pretty clear choice. I'd happily save some money and buy the 10GB model instead of the 12GB. At around £180 or $200 more, it just doesn't do enough to warrant the extra cost. And instead I could use that money to, I don't know, buy some new games or to upgrade something else. I don't know, maybe you're rocking a Ryzen 3000 series processor. So in theory, with the money you're going to save, 180 quid, $200, you could save that money, get a 5000 series and whack on smart access memory or resizable bar. As well as the IPC improvements, you're going to get some amazing performance there instead. Hopefully you see it how I do. And if you like this video, a sub to the channel and a like on this video would be amazing. We're planning to actually bring a lot more GPU content soon, including more of these head to head kind of videos. So you won't want to miss out on that. We'll also be overhauling our complete GPU testing, so that's going to happen very, very soon. We just have a few more things to do behind the scenes first. If you want to be the first to know about that, then it's well worth signing up to our Patreon, where you'll have first-hand access to things like that, other behind the scenes content, and all of the charts that we showed today in all their glory. With that, I'm going to leave it there, and I will see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.